How do you get rid of certain sounds, like maybe typing going into your microphone when you're podcasting, or maybe a dog barks in the background? How do you get rid of that? Or how perfect does your podcast really need to be? I've got some answers and philosophies that you might want to check out coming up next. Hey there, podcaster. My name is Shannon Hernandez, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. And today's video, of course, is powered by Agora Pulse. Today, I want to talk to you all about how perfect does your podcast actually need to be. I know that you, as the podcaster who is starting out, or maybe is just learning an audio editing program for the very first time, or maybe you've been around it, but you're just still not sure on how to use those editing programs. You're trying to figure out how to remove certain sounds out of the audio. And this is really all based in a philosophy. You hear me talk a lot on this channel about a philosophy. What is your philosophy? I will always put it back in your court about what your philosophy is on podcasting. And what you're learning from me on YouTube is my philosophy based off of 18 years of being in radio. And what you're also learning is that I'm teaching podcasting as though you were doing live radio. So that's something that I think you really need to understand. And since I've started teaching people how to podcast, I've also taken a very keen interest in how important the audio quality is for podcasters. Now, every time someone jumps onto my email newsletter list, which you can get on for yourself, the links are in the description down below, but anytime someone jumps on there, one of the first emails that I asked them is to take a survey and to tell me what I can learn from them about podcasting. And one of the questions that I ask in my survey is, how important is the sound quality of your podcast? Sound quality could mean the resonance, what it sounds like, the equalization, all of those little pieces that make a podcast sound deeper, or maybe it sounds a little more thinner in terms of sound. It could mean that, or it could mean content. But when I ask the question, how important is sound quality, 70% of my respondents continue to say that sound quality is probably one of the most important things when it comes down to their podcast. So what I want to share with you is I want to share the shades of what sound quality is all about, the shades of sound editing, because sound editing is not just one thing and then it's done. It's got many different facets to the philosophy of sound editing. First, let's talk about what is sound editing. And I know this seems so basic, but just bear with me here. And exactly how do you define it? Well, I don't think there's a real clear-cut definition that I have. I know there is on the internet, and you can go check it out for yourself, but this is how I define sound editing. Now, sound editing to some might be the sound or the resonance of a podcast that maybe is all dealing with the switches and the knobs and the equalizations that is in your digital audio workstation or your DAW. It could be Audacity, it could be Pro Tools, it could be Adobe Audition, whatever it is. So when you're editing, you can be editing the sound quality of the podcast. That's one form of editing. A second form of editing is the content, deleting pieces of the content that will make the podcast flow a little more smoothly. Now, is one philosophy or one type of editing more important than the other? Not really, because they're both equally important. They have to be equally important in order to create a quality product down the line. So it's really a combination of both the philosophies that you're going to have to adopt, because it will take some time to understand that the sound is going to be important and the content is going to be important. That's just part of the workflow. Now, what should you expect when you edit up a podcast? Well, again, I'm going to put this back on you and say it's all on you. It's on your philosophy. How much do you feel the podcast needs to be edited? Now, if you were to ask me, sound quality as far as the resonance and the sound of the podcast, that is by far my most important thing. I love to have clean, crisp sound like it came out of a radio station. That's what I am used to, and so there's no reason why the average podcaster can create the same sound quality that I'm creating on the radio. What should you expect when it comes down to editing up a podcast? Well, it's going to really be on you to understand the software. Have you learned the software? Do you know how to use the software efficiently? And this is all going to determine how long it takes you to edit up the podcast. It may take you 10 minutes like it takes me. Most people are like taking up a half hour to 40 minutes to edit up a podcast, where it only takes me about 10 minutes. And that's because I've developed my own system of how to edit up my own podcast so that I can spend more time doing the things that I love doing, like looking for guests or helping my clients. So again, I'll ask the question, how long does it take to edit up a podcast? As long as it's going to take. It's going to be on your workflow, and you have to decide that for yourself. Now let's talk about podcasting in terms of it being like radio. Podcasting is not, I repeat, it is not a voiceover. And you can argue with me about this, about it not being a voiceover, because the term voiceover relates to something completely different. There's radio, and then there's voiceover. Radio is what you do, like what we're doing here in a studio. There's multiple microphones, and we're in a studio. We're in a radio studio that has treated walls. These walls that we have are panels. Radio is more about coming into the studio and, conducting interviews, and it's a whole different setting when you come down to it. It's not a voiceover. This is all about the setting that you have in the studio. Now, there's different types of studios all over the nation. You can look at the Dan Patrick studio, and it's a very open studio with different types of sound treating, but it is not a voiceover studio. A voiceover studio is typically at like a local building where they have built out a room specifically for voiceovers. That can be voiceovers for movies, can be voiceovers for cartoons, it could be voiceovers for specific radio spots that are a little more clean and pristine. They're for audiobooks. That's what a voiceover is all about. And when you go into those studios, they have something called a whisper room. And the whisper rooms can vary in size. Typically, they're pretty small, and they only contain the microphone and maybe the sheet that the voiceover artist is reading off of, and that's it. And this is all to eliminate any hums or buzzes or noise floors that is going through the microphone. All of that done is in a studio across the way that is maybe about 10 feet away, separated by glass, and the voiceover artist is able to talk with the engineer about how their recording is all going. So understand that podcasting is not voiceover, okay? And your podcast does not need to sound super pristine, okay? The only reason I say this is because live radio isn't as concerned about the pristine sound that you're thinking of. Now, do they care about quality? Yes. All of these microphones in this studio all have quality processing running through them with hardware. And it allows us to broadcast a signal that is out there. But what you don't understand is that with live radio and with podcasting, there are flaws. And some of those flaws in live radio are dealing with static that is out in the public. It's dealing with a noise floor sometimes. There's computers running behind me right now that you can possibly sometimes hear that go through the microphone. You might have to deal with me saying or you might have to deal with me stumbling. Just last night, I made a mistake on the radio. So there's mistakes that go on in live radio, and it might happen for you in your own podcast. And that is not a voiceover. That's radio. Lastly, your audience, they're more concerned about your content than they are concerned about whether or not you put a Chevy Chev filter on your voice at 10 minutes and 30 seconds and deleted the sound that was going on. Like your audience really doesn't care. But it's still good to have a nice quiet area where you can go ahead and you can speak into the microphone where you're not being distracted, because you really want to give the respect of listening to your guests so that you can ask quality questions. Be careful what amateur podcast editors and podcasters will tell you about having pristine sound. You don't need to have pristine sound. You can have really great sound, but not pristine, because you will bang your head against the wall too many times and edit too much. Just know that you're not going to be using too many effects in your digital audio workstation or your DAW. You're just not going to do that. There's so many effects in Audition, Audacity, Pro Tools, Reaper that you can use, but you're creating a radio broadcast, and you don't need to be dealing with a whole lot other than maybe just a little bit of equalization and normalization in your editing process. So don't worry about too many effects. At the end of the day, your podcast needs to sound as perfect as what you make it. And I have a quick start guide that you can go ahead and check out. I'll leave the description down, or the link in the description down below. It's also going to fly up here on the video, and it shows you all the equipment that I use that really is kind of a non-negotiable. It's what I use to create sound that is very similar to what I'm using in this professional studio here. So you might want to check out what that guide has to offer and pick out all of the equipment there. The board, at least, is the non-negotiable. You need to have the Yamaha MG10XU board in order to achieve the sounds like we're getting here in this radio studio. As far as mics are concerned, there's a multitude of mics that you can purchase. It's going to be just totally up to you and what you want to purchase as far as mics are concerned. But make sure that you go ahead and you check that out. There is a video actually that teaches you all how to set up that setup for your podcast. I'll go ahead and leave a link to my blog where you can go watch that video and read all about it down below in the description below. And of course, over here on your right-hand side, I'll leave a link to that video as well. So tell me, how perfect are you making your podcast? And are you setting your sites too high or are they too low? Leave a comment down in the description below. I'd be interested in seeing what you have to say, and I'd be willing to offer any advice if it helps you create a better workflow for your podcast. Don't forget, if you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and the little bell so you can get notified when these videos are coming out every week, every Thursday. I try to do this for all of you guys. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.